What happens when Hollywood's most outspoken host pushes one of Boston's toughest actors too far? You won't believe what unfolds when Mark Wahlberg sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a lighthearted promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The tension that erupted last night has everyone talking, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why Wahlberg's dramatic exit has sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two strong personalities collide in the most unexpected way. The stage was set for what appeared to be a routine promotional appearance. Mark Wahlberg, dressed in his signature casual blazer and jeans, walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set with his usual confident stride, waving to the audience who greeted him with enthusiastic applause. The Boston native had appeared on the show multiple times before, and their previous interactions had always maintained a professional, if sometimes slightly tense, atmosphere. But something felt different from the moment Wahlberg settled into the guest chair. Kimmel, sporting his trademark smirk, opened with what seemed like standard fare. "Mark, great to have you back on the show. You know, I've been watching your career for years, and I have to say, you've certainly come a long way from your Funky Bunch days." The audience chuckled, but Wahlberg's expression remained stoic, his jaw visibly tightening at the reference to his early music career, a topic he'd grown increasingly uncomfortable discussing in recent years. "Yeah, well, we all have our past, Jimmy," Wahlberg responded, his Boston accent cutting through the studio air with a hint of irritation. "Some of us choose to focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on things that happened 30 years ago." The first crack in their facade of pleasantries was subtle, but unmistakable. Kimmel, never one to back down from potential comedy gold, pressed further. "Oh, come on, Mark. The Funky Bunch was iconic. Good Vibrations was huge. Don't tell me you don't still have those moves." He mimicked some exaggerated dance moves from his chair, drawing laughter from the audience, but a stone-cold stare from his guest. Wahlberg leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here to talk about my new film, not to be your personal entertainment. Maybe we can stick to why I'm actually here?" The studio audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the most casual viewers could sense the shift in energy. Kimmel, however, seemed to interpret Wahlberg's discomfort as an opportunity rather than a warning. "Wow, someone's touchy tonight. Relax, Mark. We're just having fun here. This is late-night television, not a congressional hearing. Fun?" Wahlberg's voice rose slightly, his famous temper beginning to show through the cracks of his professional demeanor. "Making jokes about someone's past when they're trying to discuss their current work isn't fun, Jimmy. It's disrespectful." Kimmel's smirk widened, and he turned to address the audience directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Wahlberg, everybody, always keeping it real, never taking a joke." The audience offered nervous laughter, clearly sensing the growing tension, but unsure how to respond to what was rapidly becoming an uncomfortable viewing experience. But Kimmel wasn't finished. In what would later be viewed as a critical miscalculation, he decided to double down. "You know, Mark, for someone who's made a career out of playing tough guys, you sure seem sensitive about a little harmless ribbing. What's next? Are you going to storm off like some kind of diva?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Wahlberg's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the entire studio held its breath. The camera caught every micro-expression on his face, the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his shoulders squared, the dangerous stillness that anyone familiar with Wahlberg's on-screen presence would recognize as the calm before the storm. "Excuse me?" Wahlberg's voice dropped to a low, controlled tone that somehow felt more threatening than if he had shouted. "Did you just call me a diva?" Kimmel, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the warning signs, continued his assault. "Well, if the Jimmy Choo fits." He grinned at his own joke, but the audience's response was notably muted. Even his most loyal fans seemed to sense that their host had crossed a line. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Crew members behind the cameras exchanged worried glances, and you could practically feel the producers in the control room holding their breath. Wahlberg sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his gaze locked on Kimmel with an intensity that made viewers at home shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Jimmy," Wahlberg said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of barely contained fury. "I've been doing this for a long time. I've sat through hundreds of interviews, dealt with every kind of host, answered every stupid question you can imagine. But I'll tell you what I won't do. I won't sit here and let some failed comedian who peaked writing jokes for other people disrespect me on national television." The studio fell dead silent. Even the house band seemed to stop breathing. Kimmel's smirk faltered for the first time, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Failed comedian? Mark, I think you might be confusing me with someone else. This show has been on the air for 20 years. I think I'm doing just fine." Wahlberg leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's face. 20 years of what, Jimmy? 20 years of making cheap shots at people who come on your show to promote their work? 20 years of thinking that being mean-spirited somehow makes you funny? The confrontation was escalating beyond anything anyone in the studio had ever witnessed. This wasn't the typical back-and-forth banter that late-night television thrived on. This was real, raw conflict playing out in real time. And what made it even more shocking was that it was happening between two professionals who should have been able to maintain their composure regardless of personal feelings. But Kimmel, perhaps driven by pride or simply unable to recognize when he was in over his head, decided to push even further. "You know what, Mark? Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle a little roasting without getting your feelings hurt. Is this how you react on movie sets too?" The question hit like a verbal slap across the face, and everyone in the studio knew it. Wahlberg's reputation as a professional actor was something he took seriously, and Kimmel had just questioned his work ethic and professionalism in front of millions of viewers. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Wahlberg's reaction was immediate and visceral. He shot up from his chair so quickly that it actually rocked backward, the sudden movement causing several audience members to gasp audibly. His face had transformed from controlled anger to pure rage, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of dangerous edge that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Are you out of your mind?" Wahlberg's words cut through the silence like a knife. "You want to question how I conduct myself professionally? Let me tell you something about professionalism, Jimmy. Professionalism is showing up prepared, treating your guests with respect, and not using your platform to tear people down for cheap laughs." Kimmel, clearly rattled by the intensity of Wahlberg's response but too proud to back down, tried to regain control of the situation. "Mark, come on, sit down. You're making this into something it's not. It was just a question." "Just a question?" Wahlberg remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "You just implied that I'm unprofessional on movie sets in front of your entire audience. That's not a question, Jimmy. That's character assassination disguised as comedy." The studio atmosphere had become suffocating. Camera operators were adjusting their shots to capture every moment of the unfolding drama, while audience members sat frozen, unsure whether they should be watching or looking away. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a career-defining moment playing out in real time. Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of his own show, attempted to pivot. "Look, Mark, maybe we got off on the wrong foot tonight. Why don't we start over? Tell us about your new movie." But Wahlberg wasn't interested in olive branches. The damage had been done, and his Boston-bred sense of pride wasn't going to let this slide. "Start over? You think you can just insult someone and then pretend it didn't happen? That's not how the real world works, Jimmy. That's not how respect works." "Respect?" Kimmel's voice took on a defensive edge, his own temper beginning To Flair. I've been nothing but respectful. You're the one who came on my show with an attitude problem. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and Wahlberg's expression shifted to something that anyone who'd watched his movies would recognize. The look he got right before his characters did something they couldn't take back. Attitude. Problem? Wahlberg repeated slowly, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again. Jimmy, let me explain something to you. I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've worked with everyone from David O. Russell to Martin Scorsese. I've never had an attitude problem with any director, any co-star, or any host who treated me with basic human decency. Kimmel, either unable to read the room or simply too committed to his persona to change course, made what would later be viewed as his fatal mistake. Well, maybe those directors were better at handling difficult actors. The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Even the house band leader visibly winced. Wahlberg stood completely still for a moment, and in that silence, you could practically hear the collective intake of breath from everyone present. Difficult? Wahlberg's voice was barely audible now, but somehow that made it more menacing. Did you just call me difficult? Kimmel, realizing too late that he had pushed things beyond the point of no return, tried to laugh it off. Come on, Mark. You know I'm just busting your chops. This is what we do here. But Wahlberg was past the point of accepting explanations or apologies. No, Jimmy, this is what you do here. You invite people onto your show, pretend to be their friend, and then humiliate them for your audience's entertainment. Well, let me tell you something. I didn't come here to be your punching bag. The confrontation had reached a crescendo that no one in the studio was prepared for. Wahlberg began pacing behind his chair, his movement predatory and controlled, like a caged animal looking for an escape route. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them pulling out their phones to record what they instinctively knew was television history in the making. You know what the real problem is here, Jimmy? Wahlberg continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. You've been doing this show for so long that you've forgotten the difference between comedy and cruelty. You think that because you're behind that desk and you've got your writers and your audience, you can say whatever you want to whoever sits in this chair. Kimmel, now visibly uncomfortable and clearly regretting his approach, attempted damage. Control. Mark, I think you're overreacting here. We're on television. People expect a little give and take. Overreacting? Wahlberg stopped pacing and fixed Kimmel with a stare that could have frozen water. Jimmy, I've been called a lot of things in my life. I've been criticized, mocked, and written off more times than I can count. But I've never had someone question my professionalism and call me difficult on national television while pretending it was all in good fun. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Crew members were exchanging worried glances, clearly unsure whether they should intervene or let the drama play out. The audience sat transfixed, witnessing what was clearly the most authentic moment in late-night television history, and also potentially the most destructive. Kimmel made one last attempt to salvage the situation, but his words only poured gasoline on the fire. Look, Mark, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but maybe you need to develop a thicker skin if you're going to be in this business. The apology, if it could even be called that, was worse than no apology at all. Wahlberg's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, cold determination. When he spoke again, his voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Hurt my feelings? Wahlberg laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jimmy, you didn't hurt my feelings. You showed your true character. You showed everyone watching exactly what kind of person you really are when you think the cameras are rolling and the audience is on your side. The studio had become a pressure cooker, and everyone could sense that the explosion was imminent. Wahlberg moved closer to Kimmel's desk, not in a threatening way, but with the deliberate purpose of someone who had made a decision and was about to act on it. You want to know what professionalism really looks like, Jimmy? Wahlberg's voice was steady now, controlled, but filled with an intensity that made everyone in the studio lean forward. Professionalism is knowing when to walk away from a situation that doesn't serve anyone involved. Professionalism is refusing to participate in someone else's attempt to humiliate you for entertainment. Kimmel, now visibly sweating under the studio lights, made one final desperate attempt to regain control of his show. "Mark, come on, let's just sit down and talk about this like adults. The audience came here to have a good time." Wahlberg turned to address the audience directly, his Boston accent cutting through the tension with razor-sharp clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here to have a good time, and I respect that. But what you've witnessed tonight isn't entertainment. It's a masterclass in how not to treat people. Your host invited me here under the pretense of promoting my work, then spent the entire interview trying to tear me down for his own amusement." The audience sat in stunned silence, many nodding in agreement as they processed what they had just witnessed. The cameras captured every face in the crowd, showing a mixture of shock, uncomfortable recognition, and growing support for Wahlberg's position. Kimmel, realizing that he was losing not just the interview, but potentially his entire audience, tried once more to salvage the situation. "Mark, I think you're being a little dramatic here. This is just how late-night television works. We joke around, we have fun." "Fun?" Wahlberg cut him off with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Jimmy, let me tell you what's fun. Fun is working with talented people who lift each other up. Fun is collaborating with professionals who respect the craft and the people in it. This?" He gestured around the studio with obvious disgust. "This isn't fun. This is sad." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Kimmel's face had gone pale, and for the first time since the interview began, he seemed truly speechless. The silence stretched on, broken only by the barely audible hum of the studio equipment and the collective held breath of everyone present. Wahlberg moved back, toward his chair, but instead of sitting down, he reached for the small microphone clipped to his lapel. With deliberate, measured movements, he unclipped it and placed it carefully on the side table next to his chair. The simple action spoke louder than any words could have. He was done, officially and definitively. "You know, Jimmy," Wahlberg said, his voice now carrying the weight of finality, "I've been in movies where I've played characters who walked away from fights, and I've played characters who stayed and finished them. Tonight, I'm choosing to be the guy who walks away, because staying here would mean participating in something that goes against everything I believe about how people should treat each other." The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the usually animated house band sat motionless, their instruments silent, watching history unfold before their eyes. The cameras continued rolling, capturing what everyone knew would be replayed countless times across social media and news outlets. Kimmel, perhaps finally understanding the gravity of what had transpired, made one last attempt at an apology. "Mark, if I offended you, that wasn't my intention. Maybe we can—" "If you offended me?" Wahlberg's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Jimmy, there's no if about it. You questioned my professionalism, called me difficult, and suggested I can't handle criticism. Then, when I called you out on it, you told me to develop thicker skin. That's not comedy, that's not entertainment, and it's certainly not how you treat a guest who came here to support your show." The confrontation had reached its climax, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Wahlberg's controlled fury had exposed something raw and real about the entertainment industry that most people never saw. The casual cruelty that often passed for humor, the way guests were sometimes treated as disposable content rather than human beings deserving of respect. "I want everyone watching at home to remember something," Wahlberg continued, now addressing the cameras directly. "You don't have to accept disrespect just because someone has a platform. You don't have to smile and laugh when someone tries to tear you down. And you sure as hell don't have to stick around when someone shows you exactly who they are." With that declaration, Wahlberg straightened his jacket and began walking toward the exit. But he wasn't finished yet. At the edge of the stage, he turned back to face Kimmel one final time, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Jimmy, I hope someday you figure out the difference between being funny and being cruel. Because right now, you're just another bully with a microphone, and that's not something to be proud of." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, his usual confidence completely shattered. The audience remained silent, many of them visibly uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, finally understanding that they had been complicit in something that went far beyond entertainment. Wahlberg didn't storm off. He walked away with dignity intact, his head held high, his principles uncompromised. As he disappeared behind the curtain that led backstage, the studio remained in stunned silence. No music played him off, no jokes were made, no attempt was made to lighten the mood. The gravity of what had just occurred was too profound for cheap recovery attempts. Kimmel, left alone on his stage with an audience that no longer seemed to be on his side, struggled to find words. "Well, we'll be right back after these messages," he finally managed, his voice lacking any of its usual confidence or charm. As the show cut to commercial, the audience began to murmur among themselves, many shaking their heads in disapproval. Cell phones were already out, with people typing furiously, sharing what they had just witnessed with the world. The hashtags would start trending within minutes, the clips would be viral within hours, and the conversation about respect, dignity, and the responsibility that comes with a platform would dominate social media for days to come. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become a watershed moment in late-night television. Wahlberg had done something that guests rarely do. He had refused to play along with a system that treated him as disposable entertainment. He had stood up not just for himself, but for every guest who had ever sat in that chair and been made to feel small for someone else's amusement. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate far beyond that studio. Wahlberg had walked away, but in doing so, he had made a statement that would be remembered long after the laughter from cheap jokes had faded. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own humiliation. And that's exactly what Mark Wahlberg had done on what would be remembered as one of the most explosive nights in late-night television history.